to know is that the Bevan series is made possible only with generous sponsorship of the Bevan Foundation. And if I can just point over to Tanya Bevan, maybe we can have a round of applause. As well as funding from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center and the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And now I'm going to hand over to Lisa Drumnick, who's the Dean of the College of the Environment, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Trevor. And thanks to all of you for taking time to come to this, as well as I'm sure many of you have been coming to the series that has been going on all term. It's with great pleasure that I get to say a few words about Dr. Brian Baird. Brian was born in Chalma, New Mexico in 1956. He graduated from the University of Utah with a BS in psychology in 1977. He went on to earn his master's of clinical psychology from the University of Wyoming in 1980, and then he went on to stay at that same institution to earn his doctorate in psychology. He's the former chair of the Department of Psychology at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, as well as a licensed clinical psychologist. He's published a number of journal articles and authored many books. And his most recent book is entitled Character, Politics, and Responsibility, Restarting the Heart of the American Republic, and it was just published last year. Now, one of the reasons we're particularly excited to have him here, although I'm sure we can use his services in faculty meetings as a psychologist, is the fact that in 1999, Dr. Baird was elected to the United States House of Representatives from the state of Washington's 3rd Congressional District. In Congress, he focused on science and technology, energy, healthcare, oceans, foreign policy, fiscal discipline, and congressional integrity. As chair of the Subcommittee on Energy and the Environment, Representative Baird played a leading role in crafting a new approach to energy and providing solutions to our oceans. Particularly relevant today is Dr. Baird was a leading voice in Congress on the issue of ocean acidification. Specifically, he sponsored and one passage of the Federal Ocean Acidification Research and Monitoring, or FORM Act. This act authorizes appropriations for ocean acidification research for fiscal years 2009 to 2012 at multi-million-dollar levels per year. He also sponsored the following legislation: H.R. 3650, Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendment; H.R. 1310, I won't do them all, 13, Clean Water Protection Act. This is just to give you a sense of the breadth of this concern. H.R. 52, Tropical Forest and Coral Conservation Act. H.R. 1769, the Alpine Lakes Wilderness Additions and the Pratt and Middle Forest Snoqualmie River Protection Act. H.R. 2055, the Pacific Salmon Stronghold Conservation Act of 2009, and H.R. 4029, the Puget Sound Recovery Act. He's been a leading proponent of the relevance of social science in making key environmental decisions, and so it makes me particularly excited to hear what his views are going to be about how society deals with the threat of ocean acidification. His talk is entitled "Can an Acerbic Congress Deal with Acidic Oceans?" Please join me in welcoming Dr. Baird.
The question for me would be, if you're taping one, is this the mic? If you're taping, I'm cognizant that it won't probably pick up the phone. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you all. Dean, thank you for the kind introduction, for your work here. Tanya Bevan, thank you for sponsoring this. It is a wonderful series. I wish I could have attended all of the speeches and presentations. I had the privilege of working with Dick Feely in Congress on a number of issues, and I know what a great start that was. Brad Warren and Scott Doney and many of the other speakers you've had have been really fantastic. And of course, the reputation of this institution and the work you do is world renowned and quite respected in the halls of Congress, and certainly by me personally. What I want to do is I don't have a big PowerPoint. I have one kind of scary video to show you. But I want to mostly engage in discussion to give you some of the context about how, why we worked on the 4M me some insights into what lies ahead, both pro and con. And I'll start with this, and I'm thrilled that you have this as your topic this year. Many of you know, only relatively recently did this issue of ocean acidification really come on the radar screen of the scientists themselves, but then much delayed relative to public policy makers. Some of you have seen, I had a reading list we put together for this, and some of the reading at the start are the early reports of the IPCC, in which oceans in the first several reports were mentioned just as a carbon sink as vis-a-vis temperature. No mention at all, really, of acidification in the first couple of reports. And then in the later ones, literally just a couple of paragraphs at most in the IPCC report. If you look at the Climate Action Group, the CAP program, which was a large consortium of industry and environmental groups and others, almost no discussion of ocean acidification there. If you look at the work of the Pew Climate Group, they don't talk about ocean acidification. So this is tremendously important to understand for a couple of reasons. From my perspective, and I've been probably singing this song for 5 years at least, my belief is that those concerned about climate change should never, ever say climate change without saying ocean acidification. They should, I mean, literally, you almost can't get me to say it. They're glued together in my head. Why are they glued together in my head? You all know the answer to this from the prior Bevan lectures and from your professional training. But I may give you a little bit different answer. The scientific answer is because the same CO2 that's heating the planet is causing ocean acidification. So they're connected chemically. They're connected in the physics of the whole process. But politically, in my judgment, there's another reason. First of all, I think global warming was a bad name. I like to be warm. And climate change just sounds a little too nice. Change we can believe in was the slogan of our current president. So if you pick two very nice, warm, fuzzy phrases for something that is actually pretty destructive, that's a bad deal. Now, acid, on the other hand, I get. Acid, bad. I've seen this in the movies. Throw it in the face of the monster, monster melts. Acid, bad. Acid, ocean, really bad. Now, I don't mean to be too facetious about that, but there's something even more important about it, and that's this. I was talking to David King a while back about acidification and climate change, and he was talking about, oh, well, gee, look at what the fossil record says about the history of pH levels in the ocean and what it says about the temperature when the CO2 was high. I said, David, you've got a problem here. And he said, what's that? I said, a fair significant portion of our population doesn't believe the fossil record extends back past 10,000 years. and that includes members of Congress. And David said, oh my goodness, that hadn't even occurred to me. The advantage of ocean acidification is you can do it right here in a lab bench. You don't have to worry about Lake Baikal, tree rings, fossil record. You can put CO2 over water. CO2 dissolves in water. pH changes, dissolves, shells and formula. Any questions? That's valuable to be able to do that. This is not abstract theory. This is fundamental principles of chemistry and physics, and it's happening on an enormous scale, as Dick Feely's research has shown. We had, I think, a very substantial hearing, my last hearing in the Congress before I retired, where we tried to build precisely that case on both the climate change and the acidification. What's the basic physics and chemistry? What does it say happens? Are we seeing it happen? And what are the effects? If we leave ocean acidification out, we're leaving one of our most, first of all, we're leaving out one of the most consequential impacts of CO2 production. But we're also leaving out one of our most powerful arguments in favor of change. Now let me address that for just a second. I'll put my psychology hat on here for a second. I think if you look at what's happened in terms of trying to get the public awareness of climate change and ocean, well, first we'll deal with climate change. We've gone about it in a pretty ineffective way, demonstrably ineffective. We failed in an effort to pass a cap and trade bill for a variety of reasons. But part of it is the solution was wrong in my terms. I don't think the cap and trade was the way to go. Politically, demonstrably it was wrong, and it didn't work. But beyond that, messaging-wise, if you look at the psychology of messaging, if you're doing something called a fear appeal to try to persuade somebody, it's only going to work if people believe the threat is real, it affects them, and there's something they can do about it. Now, that's a problem in the case of climate change. People have attacked whether it's real or not. Skeptical argument, so-called skeptical argument. It doesn't affect me today. It doesn't really feel like I can do much about it. But it could cost me a lot of money to try to fix it. So it's just a whole lot easier to not believe it's true. In the case of ocean acidification, if I can demonstrate that for you, right here in front of you, it's harder to believe that the phenomenon's not true. Now you have to make the next jump. And the next jump in the case of acidification, I think can be illustrated by this story. I was talking to a group of fishermen very, very passionate about restoring salmon. And the topic of the night had to do with gill nets versus commercial fishermen. This is an age-old battle in Washington State, as many of you know. It's relevant to Puget Sound, it's relevant to the Columbia River, and rivers up north as well. Age-old battle. And so I talked about my position on that, but then I said, let me tell you something, though. All that we've just talked about, all you guys have been fighting about, is going to become pretty irrelevant awfully quick if we don't deal with ocean acidification and if we don't deal with climate change and temperature increase. Look at how hard we work in this state and how much we spend to keep the waters cool. And what happens with a couple degrees centigrade rise? All that work is lost. Now here's the interesting part about ocean acidification. And I said, and what about ocean acidification? Almost nobody, this was 2 years ago, almost no one in that room of people who were passionate about fish knew anything about ocean acidification. And I said, we built the chain of evidence. And then I talked to them about pteropods. You know this phrase, charismatic megafauna? We need to make the pteropod a charismatic microfauna. Right? So that every American knows what a pteropod is. And people are going, how are the pteropods doing? When I walk the fishermen in that room through the chain of impacts of ocean acidification, these are guys who live to fish, spend a lot of money on their fishing gear, a lot of time fishing, about how it will affect pteropods, how that affects salmon, blah, 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 the chain. And said, here's the reality. If we don't get this solved, your grandkids will not be able to fish, very likely. You could all probably have heard a pin drop. If we can make something real and present and matter to people, we have a shot. If it's distant and not believed, we're not going to be effective on it. So our work to establish the Foran bill was designed to try to help the federal agencies focus more on this. Now, in fairness, people like Dick were way ahead of the curve, way ahead of our curve, and others on this, but there was not a coordinated federal effort. And myself and Jay Inslee and Maria Cantwell, Tom Allen from Maine and some others felt we really need to really focus on this. And then the question became how best to do it. So we had a couple of hearings, drafted the legislation. And the positive news was that this legislation took effect and it directed a series of federal agencies to work together to develop a comprehensive, coordinated plan because it affects many aspects of our federal work. Obviously, NOAA, USGS plays a role, NASA plays a role, National Science Foundation plays a role. The idea was let's get all of these folks to work together with a coordinated research project so that we're reducing duplication and we're making sure we're not missing some areas that we should be addressing. And we passed it. And it's the law of the land, and Dick Feely and people know and NSF are working hard to try to implement it. That's the very, very good news. Now for some bad news. The bad news is it's not even coming close to the funding levels that we need, first of all. And second of all, as many of you know, the new majority in the House is proposing to slash research funding. And the manner in which they do that, there is a fiscal crisis in this country. It's bad now. It's going to get worse. We have to address entitlements, and we have to address discretionary spending, and we're all going to have to take some hits. And in my judgment, we have to increase revenue as well as reduce spending. I think you have to do both. The new majority in the House will not talk about the revenue side. And the basic math of it is the less you talk about revenue, the more you've got to do cuts. And it's going to be, I wish I could say, to some extent, this is paradoxical to say, I almost wish it were indiscriminate. But it is actually going to be discriminating in some ways that we need to appreciate and understand. And Sherry, can you cue up this video real quick? I want to give you a context of what lies ahead a little bit. And what you're about to see is the Republicans have established, and I'm not trying to be super partisan. If the Democrats did this, I go after them. This is a videotape now on the website of majority, with Eric Cantor. Adrian Smith is a member of Republican member of the Science Committee. Go ahead, Mel.
Hi, I'm Congressman Adrian Smith. I'm from the 3rd District of Nebraska, and I'm a member of the House Committee on Science and Technology. I'm inviting you to join me in an important effort to ensure your tax dollars aren't wasted. Our founders recognized the importance of supporting scientific research and advancement, and our Constitution even includes a congressional role in advancing science. Congress created the National Science Foundation in 1950 to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. For this purpose, NSF makes more than 10,000 new grant awards annually. Many of these grants fund worthy research in the hard sciences. In fact, NSF-funded researchers have won nearly 150 Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, and medicine, research creating the foundation upon which our nation's knowledge economy is based. But recently, NSF has funded some projects I want to know your thoughts on. For example, university academics received a $750,000 grant to develop computer models to analyze the on-field contribution of soccer players. Another group of scientists received $1.2 million to model the sound of objects breaking for use by the video game and movie industries. What do you think? When the American family pays an average of $10,000 in federal taxes a year, should 75 families work all year to support soccer research? I'm asking your assistance. Help us identify grants which do not support the hard sciences or which you don't think are a good use of taxpayer dollars. Let us know what you think by sending a message to the web form located below. We will compile your input and begin developing legislation to eliminate wasteful spending. Thank you, and have a good day.
So, I'll give you all that URL. I want to jump at this tonight. Adrian's got a good point. I'm a huge federal deficit. We can't afford to waste money. We have to monitor how we're spending. The problem is that the mechanism here is to post a list of NSF grants, and then you get to vote, sort of like voting people off the island. And you can say, oh, I don't, and they actually have suggestions. If you see words like, what is it, justice, or lawyers, or culture, you can go through and take these off, and then they'll sort of tally this up. The problem, though, is, here's the hit. Oh, great, I got mine. This is fun. The game goes like this. Take research into pteropods, and ocean acidification, and juxtapose it in a motion before Congress to take funding from research on pteropods and put it towards breast cancer research. And then dare somebody to vote against that switch.
With millions of American women dying of breast cancer, Congressman Brian Baird will spend the money instead on studying microscopic snails.
That's fine. I want to retire this out.
things, and they've got aragonite and calcium carbonate, and if the pH level goes down, which actually means acid goes up, yeah, I know it's going down, but it's really going up, you're toast. We have a responsibility, we in the scientific community and the ocean community, to do a couple of things. First, we need to make mighty sure that we can justify what we do. And I'm an academic, and I know research, and I've chaired the NSF committee, and I will tell you, there are bodies buried there. Not all of us could go in front of a guy who makes his living driving a log truck or working and risking his life at a steel mill or whatever, and saying, I do want to take your taxpayer dollars and fund this. Not all of our research is worthy of that. And if we're going to fund it federally, it should, by golly, be worthy of it. And we ought to be able to defend it. Or we shouldn't be doing it on taxpayer dime. I actually absolutely believe it. But by the same token, if it is worthy of it, we have to be able to defend it. The challenge now in the tight fiscal time is going to be that we've got worthwhile legislation developed over actually several years of research and hearings and testimony and scientific analysis, and not just the hearings before Congress, but the best minds getting together in other areas. That is now all going to come under attack. And it will come under not an indiscriminate attack, but a discriminating attack. An attack not only based on let's find things that we think sound silly, but let's ridicule the scientific endeavor generically, let's ridicule the scientists, and let's ridicule the institutions they work for, and thereby justify the cuts. And how much nicer it is if that is also connected to something we don't want people to, in quotes, believe in, i.e., climate change and ocean acidification. Now again, I think the ocean acidification piece is harder for the skeptics to deal with. I will tell you, and we've had multiple hearings on these issues, never have we had an even marginally effective counter to the ocean acidification charge. We get the skeptics coming out of the woodwork on climate change. But they're pretty moved about ocean acidification. Now, maybe they just haven't marshaled their forces yet. But it's also, I think, because the evidentiary trail is pretty solid. Which, again, begs the question, if that's the case, why haven't Pew and CAP and IBCC and others globbed onto this? It's been a fight, I will tell you. When I say to people, always say ocean acidification in the context of climate change. Some people literally roll their eyes. Why would we want to do that? You want to do that because it's a compelling fact and it's tremendously dangerous to the planet, and we need to fund it. We're talking now, the legislation authorized, I think, $60 million. We're now funding it at about $5 million. NOAA and NSF each has about that. And that may be up for further cutting. Now, as you know from prior testimony, I believe we've saved a lot of money in the shellfish industry. And the shellfish industry, that's my district. Willow Bay is the 3rd congressional district. And when they were having 80% mortality in their oyster seed, as Dick's research and others from here showed, that was related to acidic water. That's valuable scientific information, but if we don't do a better job as scientists of explaining that and defending it and publicizing it, then those attack ads like I just gave, well, you would like it. In the ideal world, where when that voice comes on and says, Brian Baird, what does this study ocean acidification? People go, yeah, he's got my vote. We're not there yet. And we need to get there, and we need to get there urgently. Because as you know, the scariest part about this particular phenomenon is that it's got a really long tail. It's not like we shut the spigot off today and the problem starts cleaning itself up tomorrow, as far as our best understanding. So here we are with a major existential threat to the oceans and to coral reefs and many of our fisheries, and we're spending grounding dust on it. It's a lot of money, but it's nothing like relative to what we spend in thousands of other pick-your endeavors. And so my hope would be that the scientific community can give some serious thought to how we message this better. We tended, in the environmental side, I will tell you from my perspective in Congress, the focus became on passing cap and trade rather than reducing carbon. And we put all the money after, all the energy went into cap and trade, and the bill was frankly crafted in a complex and rather chimerical union of Duke Energy and the NRDC, which is a pretty interesting alliance. And it didn't work. Even if it had worked, it wasn't that great. But we focused all on that, and we neglected getting the public to understand why it mattered to begin with. We proposed an extraordinarily complex and costly solution to solve a problem they weren't sure was real and that didn't affect them directly, but the costs were going to affect them directly. We have a chance, I think, still, and we have a responsibility. Set aside the chance. We don't have a choice. We have to get people to understand why this acidification thing matters so much and why we need to do something urgently about it and what the consequences are. And I'll close my prepared remarks and then open it up to questions with this. Some years ago, I had the great privilege and exciting. My wife and I, Rachel and I, went to the Maldives Islands. She was living in Italy, working at the UN. We went to the Maldives. And so, Maldives is, this ring of coral atolls. I mean, you can't believe it. There are these little perfectly round coral atolls out in the middle of a beautiful, smooth sea. And on the way out to this island where we were going to be staying, we stopped in the middle of the sea to dive. Dropped off the boat. It was shallow enough, we were just snorkeling into the drift kind of thing, so it was a nice, smooth current. What had once been one of the most beautiful coral reefs in the world had been hit by a bleaching event about a year and a half earlier. So you jump into the water, and your expectation, if you're a diver, you kind of know what you're going to see. Oh man, we're going to see some fan corals, there's going to be staghorn corals, and there's going to be all these beautiful fish, and it's going to be great. And because there's a current, you get this magic experience of sort of flying. You just sit there on the surface of the water and breathe through these snorkel, and you just fly over this beautiful sea. What we saw instead looked like Mount St. Helens right after the blast. Everything was down. Everything was dead. It was gray. It was bone-colored gray. Just a dust, almost like the St. Helens dust color. And as you floated with that current, you kept thinking, it can't all be like this. But it pretty much was all like that. With a couple of exceptions of what are those, I'm blanking on the name, the blue starfish that eat coral. What's it? Crown of thorns. Every now and then, your big color splash would be a crown of thorns. Well, that's a highlight. And you thought to yourself, wait a second, that happened in a year? We had a huge bleaching event internationally this last year. Big bleaching problem. As science will tell you, exacerbated in a bad synergy with acidic water. If that's the future we're leaving to our kids, I've got twin 6-year-old boys, the thought that if we don't get acidification under control, coral reefs as we know them will be profoundly affected for a very long time. The polar regions, fundamental food source for so many organisms on Earth, will be profoundly affected. The basic food chain on up from pteropods to salmon and other fish will be profoundly affected. And my hunch, sadly, is that most members of Congress today, and certainly most members of the general public, still don't even know what ocean acidification is, how it functions, or why we need to do something. This lecture series is really tremendously important, and all of you who are involved in this, I'm very grateful for your work, and we have no choice but to succeed in this, and I hope we will, but it will take a joint effort. So let me open this up to any questions about the act, the legislation, the problem, whatever. Let's just have a good discussion. I'll learn from you in this process.
Is that long tail you refer to a risk in enacting the legislation to provide the funding that you seek? In other words, if we change all our worst habits comprehensively today, it would still take decades to
It is to a degree. I mean, it's part of the psychological problem of selling. So the question was, is the long tail, is that part of the challenge of getting the funding for this? I'll address it several ways. First of all, the psychology of it that I see it, the sort of messaging challenge. So we drove a Toyota Prius, and happily so, and I'm a vegetarian, and my thermostat set much lower than my wife would like it. and we do what we can, but our carbon footprint's still pretty big. But when you're driving down the freeway and you see just endless chain of cars in front and endless chain of cars in back, the whole notion of diffusion of responsibility, there is a sense of desperation of, is my change really truly going to make a difference? My own belief would have been that after the last presidential election, it would have been just awfully nice with President Obama and John McCain, who has been to Antarctica, as have I, and has seen the evidence and has actually spoken passionately a while back about climate issues. It would have been awfully nice if they'd come to the American people along with some generals. The Navy gets this, by the way. The Navy has a whole task force working on this. It's not a fleet of task force, but a task force of people. And they get it. And so we should have had the generals, the president, and the presidential candidate. We should have all come together and said, we face an existential crisis. Truly an existential crisis. We could mandate that you do things, or we could call upon you as loyal Americans to do the right thing. My own belief is we should have set a goal of 20% reduction in CO2 in 20 weeks. Not by 2020, 20 weeks. It's imminently doable at the individual level. And if you don't believe it, go home and take your normal, long, hot, too high pressure shower, mark and close the drain, and then mark with a grease pencil or something, a Sharpie just as a reminder. And then take a military shower where you get a little wet, lather up, then rinse it off. You can save 80% right there. I mean, drive the speed limit, we know 10% savings. We can put together a 20% savings in no time. They didn't do it because nobody wants to call on the American people to make any change. Roosevelt didn't say, Roosevelt didn't go on TV, Franklin didn't go on TV and say, my fellow Americans, we face an existential crisis from Nazi Germany. We've just been attacked by Japan. I'm calling upon you to support a cap-and-trade bill to help research. He said it's our moral responsibility to deal with this, and we haven't done it. So the first problem is we just haven't, people themselves haven't said, I'm in this, you're in this, you're in this. Bob Cialdini's research out of Arizona, if you don't work on this stuff together and be part of the greater good, it doesn't go. So that's one problem. The second problem is you don't have a pact for ocean acidification. You do. I mean, there's ocean champions. That's about it. There's big pacts for the energy industry. There's big pacts for coal plants. We don't have a political mechanism whereby people say, this is a priority among all the other priorities for me. But there is this sense, if I live in Colorado or Utah or Arizona or Kansas or Nebraska or any of those, why should I care about ocean acidification? Now there's been some effort, messaging-wise, to say, well, let's look at, and I think you'll have some speeches here which are good. Let's look at the socio-economic impacts. It's easy in the Willapa Bay. When you represent the Willapa and oyster growers come and say, hey, we're down the tubes if we don't get this fixed. It's harder when you're in the inlands. On the other hand, here's an interesting thing I just learned last week. You know where the largest scuba club in America is? Denver. You don't need scuba clubs. We can go diving, right? If you want to dive in Denver, you got to get together with a bunch of other people and fly somewhere. But the point is, we can find ways to make this relevant, and we have to do that. So we have to counter that sense that, A, it's so far away geographically, or so far away chronologically, or so helpless, so massive that I can't do anything. All those things together have to be countered. And then I think we have to show, and I was going to almost say I hate to refer to Dick, but I love to refer to Dick. He's got research that says, look, we studied the acidity of the water. We gave that information to the oyster growers. They saved more than we're spending on the research. So we've got to show that if you actually do things and learn things from your research, you can actually save money. So it's not insurmountable. It's not so far down the road that we can't worry about it. It's not a done deal yet. And you individually have to do something. We've got to get that message. We have gotten almost none of those successfully out. If you can't get any of those out, you can't win.
Do you have some recommendations for how we as scientists can do a better job of communicating the urgency of this problem to the public, and that people can do some
I do, and I really appreciate the question. You know, I'm trained as a scientist, and I value very much the independence and rigor of science. And I also know that we as scientists have to be very honest about the limits of our data and our conclusions. But there's a difference between saying there's always uncertainty, so we can never act, versus the preponderance of the evidence tells us this. And the basic, I think the tremendously important thing for scientists is to patiently walk people through, and why I love ocean acidification is it's really not hard. In 1 minute, you can tell the story of ocean acidification. And you should about 30 times a day. I'm not at all facetious about that. In 1 minute. You know, chemists, physicists, and ocean scientists know this. If you put CO2 over seawater will dissolve the CO2 and it will change the chemistry of the water. It will make it more acidic. We also know that shelled organisms build their shells out of minerals. You and I know from childhood what happens if you put minerals in acid. If you're a shelled organism and you're in more acidic water, you don't have those minerals to create your shell with. If you can't create a shell, you perish. If you perish, everything that ate you perishes. Everything from coral, and if you're a coral reef, you can't build your shell. You can't build a reef. If you can't build a reef, all the creatures that depend on that reef perish. That's why it matters. That was a minute. And then you have to say, so I know this is unpleasant, but we got to do something about that. You cannot say, gee, that's unpleasant, but I don't want to think about it. You have to say, that's unpleasant, and I have a responsibility as a human being and to my next generation to do my part to fix it. And then the scientists need to do that, so that the so-called skeptics, and I say so-called skeptics, they're not skeptics at all. I personally studied the skeptics, so I'm back to the pre-Socratic Pyrrho and Sextus and Pyrrho, read all their stuff. Skeptics actually ask questions. These guys don't question. They accept the disagreement without question. This is a direct quote from a colleague in Congress. MD from the state of Georgia, a guy named Paul Brown. I'm not speaking out of school because he said this, public record. 4 PhD climate scientists in the science committee, Paul says to them, in quotes, you all have drank the Kool-Aid. And then the next, I'm paraphrasing, I know the first part is 100% quote. The next is, there is no scientific evidence whatsoever for climate change. It's a hoax, and you have no scientific integrity if you perpetuate that hoax. Member of the Science Committee of the United States Congress, now in the majority in the House of Representatives. You folks have to help other folks understand that his perspective is just not right. There's plenty of scientific evidence. But again, Paul has never gone after ocean acidification. So why have we not been talking about it? It's as big a problem, and I think these are something. I'll sort of work my way up.
So now that we are missing one major champion in Congress to counter arguments like that, who are the most effective members of the House and Senate today?
Well, we're really lucky in the sense that Jay Inslee has been just an absolute champion for renewable energy. He was one of the first people to talk about ocean acidification. You know, he's got this book called Apollo's Fire, which I recommend to you. And Jay's really been a champion on this. Maria Cantwell was a real champion on the Senate side, along with Senator Lautenberg. The issue now is going to be how we fight for the funding. And I think, frankly, we also need some Republican champions. I would, for example, try to reach out to Congressman Riker. You know, he's a Puget Sound member of the Puget Sound caucus, all as it were. I don't think there is such a thing, but we're all of us who border the Puget Sound have an interest in it. And Congressman Reichert's had a strong interest in the environment. So you have to try to reach both sides of the aisle, and it has to be kind of clear why this really matters. And the Puget Sound, as you know from NOAA's research, it has some real acidification problems. And so to try to reach out to those folks and get them to understand it, You know, the real sad thing on the Science Committee was we lost 2 allies, and I want to really underscore this next point. One of the strongest advocates on the Republican side for climate change was a guy named Bob Inglis. He was the ranking member, but in the Congress, the minority party, so I was the chair of the Energy Environment Subcommittee, he was my ranking member. He was a senior Republican, not necessarily in seniority, but he was their highest ranking member on that committee. Bob and I went to Antarctica together, and I led the trip, and we put together a fantastic trip. It was Antarctica, the Corunda Rainforest, and our committee had jurisdiction. At that time I was on NSF, the Committee of Jurisdiction over NSF. Corunda Rainforest in Australia and the Great Barrier Reef. 3 major ecosystems, all jeopardized by climate change, and in the case of the reef, by ocean acidification. Astonishing research, breathtaking, life-altering research, and amazing places. And Bob comes back and he says, I think we've got a real problem here, and I think we've got to do something about it. Bob proposed, I think, very elegant, instead of a 1,000-page cap and trade, about a 50 or 60-page bill, which was a simple carbon tax where you take the carbon and use it to offset Social Security revenue. So from a Republican perspective, it was revenue neutral. Yes, it was a tax increase on a certain area, but it was revenue neutral because it then offset payroll taxes. Elegant, simple, doable. 5 Republicans ran against Bob with the express purpose of defeating him because he, in quotes, believes in climate change. Bob was beat. He got 29% in the primary. Bert Ehlers, Republican physicist from Michigan, one of the long-standing stalwarts of the Science Committee, a wonderful human being. Bert was in his late 70s, and he just, he retired. So we lost both of those guys. Myself, I retired. We lost some other good people. And so we've got to try to build some of those champions on both sides of the aisle. And I think constituencies of scientists, help them understand where the evidence is, are incredibly, incredibly important. And end user groups, like shell fishermen, like other fishermen, have to go to them and say, look, this is what we want you to do.
So, yeah, you talked about the message, and you talked about strategies for, like your anecdote about the diving in Colorado was an interesting anecdote. I was curious about other strategies for messaging the public, whether there's potential allies that aren't currently engaged yet in the ocean acidification, in your opinion, how to pull out those groups to be messaged specifically?
Well, I think especially fishing groups. I think especially sports fishing. Especially the salmon and steelheaders. I mean, those guys, they live for this stuff. And it really matters to them. Obviously, the commercial fishing folks have an interest. The dive community has an interest. All of those are our target groups. But I actually think, those of us who grew up with 3 TV stations, and even in the pre-color days, thought the undersea world with Jacques Cousteau was just bloody amazing. On a black and white TV, imagine what I don't think I ever saw it in color, and I still loved it. I think the general public really loves the ocean, and they get how pretty they are. And I think you just got to get the general public to see that pre-post image that I saw in Maldives and elsewhere. To put a bad and sad footnote on the trip we took to Antarctica, that attack ad voice I just used has been used against every single member who went on that trip. It is a dangerous but real situation now that members of Congress cannot come close to the oceans. You can go to a national park. You can go to Yellowstone National Park, and there's not going to be an attack ad. But if you get close to an ocean, there's only one possible reason you win. Congressional boondoggle, personal recreation, and taxpayer expense. Regardless of your committee of jurisdiction, regardless of what you're doing there. And so the problem is, you can't see it. In an ideal world, I would put every member of Congress on 747, and I would fly them to the inner reef of the Great Barrier Reef, which is beat to crap. I can say crap now. It's just beat up. It's heartbreaking. Now, if you've never seen a healthy reef, you don't know the difference. If you're like going up to Mount Rainier, and there's normally a meadow with lupin and columbine and fireweed and all this other great stuff, if you've never seen it and now it's a bunch of dandelions, you go, oh, what a pretty meadow. All those yellow flowers. We ought to take them there, and then we ought to take them down to the northern Hawaiian Islands or some of the other way distant islands and say, here's what a healthy reef looks like. And have them, I get it. We've got to somehow defend that, because I think the general public doesn't want to, the reality is really troubling.
I believe most, if not all, of the subcommittees on the House Science Committee are chaired in this Congress by freshmen Republicans. Is that right?
I don't know the answer, to be honest. I haven't. The full committee is chaired by Ralph Hall, who's actually the most senior member of the Congress itself. I haven't checked to see if there's.
Okay. I just wonder whether there's a general lack of interest in science in general, among new members and among this kind of shift in politics, or whether that's it. I mean, that's not just a lack of interest in climate change, but it's science in general.
The unfortunate answer, yes. I mean, to be perfectly honest, look, you're not going to raise a lot of money on the science committee. If you're on NASA, you have a shot, in terms of funding your campaign. But if you're on the Energy and Environment Committee or have, the NSF Committee, which is Research and Education, which I've chaired, you're not going to go to a lot of donors and have them say, oh, please help my political campaign. Neither, in most cases, you're going to be able to go back to your constituents and say, I used to joke and say that I was one of the lead, I wrote the harmful algal blooms bill. And in fact, it got ridiculed on the floor of the House. We brought it up under a rule that required a 2/3 vote. We lost. And so we brought it up a few days later under a rule that required a simple majority vote. It happened that our leadership did that because they needed a vehicle to keep the House in because we were working on something else. So Republican after Republican after Republican, and if it sounds partisan, that's their problem. That's who did it, okay? Went to the floor and said, why are we debating algae? And I said, I have a reason, it could kill you. In Vancouver Lake, guy goes to the lake, throws his softball or his tennis ball in, favorite dog, jumps into Vancouver Lake, gets softball, comes out, dies. Any question? Harmful algae. Again, he's studying algae. It matters. They don't get it. They truly don't get it. There's been a proposal on the other side to eliminate the Advanced Research Project Agency for Energy, ARPA-E, which is modeled after DARPA, which is the incredibly successful program for defense. ARPA-E is the single most exciting program I've seen in the Congress, in our U.S. government in probably a decade. Incredibly important. Some of those guys want to zero it out. If anything's going to save this country, it's ARPA-E, in my judgment, and save us from ocean acidification and from climate change. It's something that will come out of that will just completely quantum leap and change the game in energy. These guys don't want to get it. And sadly, heartbreakingly, for somebody who loves science, I think you can tell, the Science Committee has been somewhat of a backwater. And it was not turned to by leadership heavily during the climate debate, interestingly enough. And they don't tend to appoint people to it based on their scientific rigor or passion. And now maybe some of these guys will come around, some of the new folks, because they'll be there. But it's deemed a tool of your ideology in some cases.
Okay, but even if you convince people that ocean acidification is a real problem and that CO2 has to be reduced, and then they'll say, but China, and until they clean up, we're not going to clean up.
Well, that was the problem with Kyoto, wasn't it? I mean, and it's to some extent a legitimate problem, but if you're concerned, a few things about it. One, if you're concerned about China, then you sure ought to quadruple, if not quintuple, ARPA-E funding. I mean, if you're really worried about China, you ought to do massive investments in U.S. renewable infrastructure and technology, and make darn sure that you don't, as happens so often, that we don't develop the core technology and then that gets exported to China and they then mass produce it at a lower rate. But we're not doing that. In fact, we're proposing slashing our most innovative research. So point one is, if you're really worried about China, which you ought to be, I think, then massively increase your investment in renewable, don't cut it, which is what some are trying. Point two, okay, fair enough, But if they're going to put out a lot of CO2, but they're also vastly outpacing us in their installation of solar and wind, etc. And the mere fact that they put out a lot doesn't excuse us, because frankly, historically, we got them way beat. And it is a legitimate and honest moral question why 5% of the globe's population for so long has produced 20 to 25% of emissions that affect the entire world and can literally inundate the lands of many, many other people. If you are doing something that can destroy your neighbor's home, don't you have a moral responsibility to change your conduct and help your neighbor out? And is it a sufficient moral argument to say, yeah, well, I'm hurting their home, but you know, Joe up the street, he's hurting it too. You can't go to church and have anybody let you get away with that. So why do you do it? And we've got to press that.
They do it every day.
Yeah.
They go to church and
Not my church, not church I went to, man. They were all about personal responsibility.
You know, what you're saying now in some ways is giving a different answer to the question you're posing, and let me explain that. You're arguing it's interesting that by sharpening the debate on climate change, we'll focus on ocean acidification to make it more real, tangible, and so forth. And I think that's interesting. And yet, when I think about social movements that have succeeded, sometimes they succeed by going the opposite direction. The issue gets more diffused, it gets linked with other things, and you build the coalition because suddenly you're all in it together. You know, and I was thinking actually of Martin Luther King. It was all about civil rights, except that late in his career, he turned very publicly and noisily against the war in Vietnam. If you read the history, what it says is that brought along a lot of white folks who weren't really quite with the civil rights movement. It made the difference then. The coalition for civil rights was now too big to ignore. So I guess my question is, where's that coalition for this topic? Because I'm not sure you beat it by just educating people about ocean acidification, but I think what I heard President Obama doing when he was running, you know, green energy, jobs for America, renewables, that's, why isn't labor out there behind this issue?
Well,
I think we failed to make that argument.
It's a multi-part question. Let me deal with the labor part. First of all, a lot of labor is IBEW, particularly the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers has been pretty much all over this, as well as some other unions. But in fairness, some of the union jobs would be threatened by this. Mine workers are in a real conundrum, as are in some cases boilermakers and some others. Now, at the same time, depending on the industry, you get different subgroups. And so we do need to make the jobs argument much better than we made it. And in fact, there are a lot of jobs being created by that. My own take is that was part of the mistake of the cap and trade argument. You know, cap and trade, what the hell is cap and trade? Job, I get a job. I understand jobs. Cap and trade, I don't know what it is, but it sounds awfully complicated, and it's going to cost me a lot of money, and it's going to take my job away. The Energy Jobs Creation Act, better name, and if you actually tax carbon and put it into something else that would create some jobs, you got a shot. So I think the jobs argument has to be prevalent. I think you absolutely have to do that. I think we have to enlist the churches. I actually see it as a moral issue. You know, come on now. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. The corollary ought to be, don't do unto others what you don't want done unto you. I think that was one of the missing books. But it ought to be there. And people from the pulpit ought to be saying to people, look, this is our religious duty. Now, here's what's actually tragically happening. A friend of mine and a colleague, John Shimkus, actually said he was in line to chair the Energy and Commerce Committee, which oversees energy policy to some significant degree, and was one of the main sources of the cap and trade bill. John actually said he didn't think we had to worry about it because his reading of the Bible said Noah would not inflict another flood on humankind. And John was a sincere, nice guy. He's a good friend. I like him a bunch. And my take was, I'm not going to try to read God's intent, but, I don't remember the Bible didn't say God would prevent mankind from doing something stupid. He may not get mad and do it again. I was like, okay, you got more screwed up, man. I think we need to try to do that. I think we need to try to reach out in some creative ways, and it needs to get past our normal sort of, it's so easy for those who care about these issues and are knowledgeable to sit around with others who care about it and are knowledgeable and completely diss everybody else. Disregard them and disrespect them, and not try to reach out to those folks. And so some of our communications are the kind of thing that people who are already on the side are going to go, oh gosh, didn't that move you? But the other people are going to be totally untouched by it because we didn't speak to them in any way that mattered. The great thing about representing Southwest Washington is the district goes from Olympia down to the Columbia River and the coast all the way to the Cascades. So we've got everything from the Evergreen State College to the Uncle Sam sign on I-5. And you have to talk to people from many different perspectives. And I think that's a strength, and I don't think we've done that well on this issue, and I think it's cost us.
You mentioned earlier in your talk about using the AirPods and icon. And that's been used, same technique has been used to mobilize, to have environmentalists mobilize for the whales back in the day, and Greenpeace, and spotted owl, forestry, which is scientific issue.
Yep.
But somehow the imagination was done to get public away from advertising. And I think that's everybody's imagination. Yeah, we've got to save the forest down there. So I would say the other way, suggest that around for a bit.
I'm actually very serious about it. Yeah, I mean, you know, whales have the advantage. We believe they're pretty smart. They're mammals. They're huge, and it's really how they're killed. I mean, those are all winners for the people. Yeah, but a pteropod, we really got. No, I mean it's really interesting. That's the challenge. That is a symbolic challenge. We've got to get people to understand that these small things really matter on the big scale. And what we are doing will affect those small things, but it's going to chase you on out, way up to the things that matter. I mean, ask the average person what a salmon eats, and they're going to go, I don't know, worms? Really? And that's not their fault. How are they supposed to know what a salmon eats? They're not one. They don't have to feed salmon on a daily basis, but ask them where those things come from and help link all that. And the question the lady asked earlier about how can scientists be involved? Kids get it, by the way. You know, kids, little kids, they're all, wow, you know what? Neat, they get it. We've got to try to, you know, do that. And we, again, we sort of, there's a model of behavioral change that is beautiful in psychology. And it goes like this. People go through stages of change. It's by Norcross and Prochaska and some others if you want to look it up. But it's people, the model is people go through stages of change. They go from pre-contemplation to contemplation to readiness to change and maintenance. Here's the key finding of this. An example would be, if you want to move somebody from one stage, you got to move them from that stage to the next stage, and you can't cheat. You can't jump stages. Because when you try to jump stages, you get resistance, not movement. And think about this. You got a friend who's got a drinking problem. You say to him, Bob, you're a disgusting drunk and you ought to go to AA tomorrow. You try to move him from pre-contemplation to change. It's going to be a whole lot more effective. You say, you know, Bob, it seems to me lately that there have been a lot of times when you just are having a whole lot more to drink than I'm used to you having. I'm a little worried about it. I haven't asked Bob to stop drinking. I haven't asked him to go to a 12-step program. I haven't called him a drunk. I've said something that might get him to move to contemplation. When it comes to the pteropods, we're way as a society in pre-contemplation. But if we could get people to understand, you know what, there are these critters called pteropods, and they're endangered because the ocean's getting more acidic. Did you know that? Not. Quit driving your behemoth car, not impose the carbon tax. Not, just think about it a little bit. So that the next time I talk to you, maybe you move from pre-contemplation to contemplation. And once you're contemplation, maybe we'll get to readiness. That really matters. And we've done that. And the reason is that you're all immersed in it. And I'm immersed in it. And Al Gore's immersed in it. And Jay's immersed in it. And we're all... So it's very hard for us, again, again, back to the science question, it's very hard for us who have lived this, breathe it, are terrified by it, to go back and say, take a breath and say, I know you've never heard of pteropods, probably, have you? I wouldn't expect you to. I sure hadn't. But here's what they are. They're pretty cool, and here's why they matter. And this is an interesting thing that's happening. And the hard part is to not, at that point, then say, so don't you want to change? The hard part is to take a breath and let them work on it a little bit. I really mean that. And we don't have much time, but we better take the time, because the data on change in psychology are, they try to jump the stage and actually push people back. In the healthcare debate, when you try to tell everybody, you got 250 million Americans who have health insurance, you got 50 million who don't, and the 250 haven't thought about it, and you tell them we're going to have a whole new healthcare system. If they haven't thought about it, you can expect resistance, not movement. We haven't seen that happen.
Along the lines of getting people excited about pteropods, are there any of the larger national NGOs that have gone on to this issue at all? Or any of them involved in the legislation, or is that really just a scientific?
Great question. Yes. Sigourney Weaver did some great work on this. And some of the readings I put up, I don't know if that's available on the website. She, was it called Acid Test, I think the movie did. Sigourney Weaver did some great stuff. NRDC has done some good things. What hasn't happened is the inextricable, eternal, and insistent link on climate change and ocean acidification. And I actually refer to global overheating. I hate to overheat. I mean, I really hate it. I mean, don't you hate it? It just sucks that it's overheating. Warming's not so bad. I'll do warm. You can warm me up, it's okay. But to overheat me, I really don't like it. So I actually say we ought to talk about atmospheric global overheating and acidification of the ocean. Let's call it by what it is, because if you're an animal, a 2-degree temperature change is nothing but overheating in most cases, and increase. So some have done it, but the focus was so much on climate change, for understandable reasons historically, but no longer understandable, and no longer acceptable, and no longer strategically smart. You got your butts kicked, environmental community. And by the way, Bob Inglis, ask Bob what happened, because he believes in climate change. Ask about 20 of my Democratic colleagues who took the vote on the cap and trade bill. I mean, we got nothing out of it legislatively, and we lost some really, really good people. So I speak from some frustration from having talked to some of these groups and said, look, you are missing one of your most potent arguments and one of the most legal consequences that is subject, the cause of this, the result of the very same problem you're trying to work on. Why not use it? And to be honest, they've been pretty resistant to that, and it's been an astonishing puzzle for me. They sort of get set in their ways. This is our messaging. This is what we think, and that's why, again, my meetings like this are so important and the work we do. So I was going to say I'll finish, but if you guys have a question or a comment, I'll take it.
Curiosity is, it seems to me that we should be thinking about cooperation with the foundations, cooperation with the NGOs, at a level that's much higher than I've seen so far. And from your perspective, is that possible that you guys develop partnerships with the foundations and NGOs?
I think, just as in an analogous way that the 4M bill, the reason the Federal Ocean Acidification Research and Monitoring Act is structured the way it is because it was recognized that a number of federal agencies had a common interest in this issue, and they were not working together as effectively as we could. Hence, we created a superstructure. We actually borrowed from JSOS, as you know, but to coordinate those efforts. I think, we can't legislate this, but I think there's a need, an analogous need within the NGO community to do a very comparable thing on the issue of ocean acidification. With a coherent strategy of how do you communicate the problem, how you communicate it not just to your own members, but to the general public, with a coherent strategy of a solution, but not in such a way that, well, if cap and trade is a solution, we focus on cap and trade, but a solution that is going to work but that you first get people to understand why the problem is there. I think there is a need for that. Now, as far as to the degree to which the government can coordinate, already we have hearings where members of NGOs are invited. A likely alliance between government science agencies per se and NGOs right now would I think not necessarily be prudent, because you're going to bring a reign of terror of oversight hearings, sort of constantly investigating. That's going to be the dynamic of unfortunately, much of the housework, well, not housework, the work in the house over the next, the next couple of years, I'm afraid. So I think there needs to be a 4M-like group within all the major environmental groups that just hammers away at this message. And it really helps people understand it and understand why it matters. And I think it needs to be a campaign. I mean, literally, when I ran for office, people wore little square Baird buttons. Why square? Because they don't see a lot of square buttons. Why buttons? Because I couldn't afford media. But if I see that person in the grocery store with a little button and a pteropod that says, "Ask me about pteropods," I'm dead serious about this. So, right? It seems Cornwall, right? How else is the supermarket clerk who's trying to feed the kids, trying to keep her job, trying to get the house clean, trying to get the kids to school, trying to find a sitter for the night, trying to deal with whatever else he or she is trying to deal with? How is she's supposed to learn about pteropods? Now, at the same time, that's just one more thing I need to worry about. Thanks a lot, pal. Now the ocean's dissolving. I thought my kid wet his pants was the problem. Now the ocean's dissolving. I guess that wet pants is not so bad after all. It helps the kid, at least. Takes the pressure off him. But if you can then say, and there are some simple things we can do about it. That's the next step. Simple things we can do about it. And it matters. That's the next transition. And we need, I actually think the problem's that urgent. That it's of that gravity. And the fact that, so few colleagues in Congress and so few people in the country get it, and if we fund it at such low levels, given the gravity of the situation, is troubling. And that funding change, that knowledge change, will best be driven, as someone was suggesting earlier, if you get grassroots. I mean, I would love it if I were at the town hall and somebody got up and said, "What are you doing about ocean acidification and pteropods and coral reefs?" That's a goal, is to have every member of Congress at the town hall hear that instead of the stuff you hear. Thanks for letting me join you, and thanks for your work.